Okay, good morning. We're going to continue with Leviticus. This week, I'm going to save a little time and not do a review. I think you know where we've been. We spent a lot of time talking about holiness and God calling us. And last week, Doc brought out some real interesting things from chapter 8 through 10 on the priest. Uh, so if you didn't hear that, you want to go back and look. This week we'll be looking at chapters 11 through 15, which is a lot. It's 250, 300 verses. I don't remember. So we won't be reading it all. We'll do a clip here and there and summarize. So if we miss your favorite verse, just jump in at some point and we'll try to talk about it. And Michelle's laughing. Okay. Okay. But it's the grouping together. The reason it's grouped, as you can see on the right part of the handout, which I didn't hand out. Here's my volunteers for handouts here. I got to quit moving. My shirt is hitting the mic. Thank you. But as we've talked about, we've kind of broken Leviticus into 7 sections, which is pretty common in the outlines you see. And this is the third section on purity, clean, unclean. These 4 chapters we'll go through briefly, and then I'm hoping to have a good amount of time for some discussion about the general overall, what thoughts about that and perceptions, lessons, things we might take away and apply to today. But first, they all deal with unclean, clean. And it's kind of a shift. Well, each section is a shift, really. But it's kind of a shift from, we've been talking about, really about the altar, about coming to God. First 7 chapters about offerings. The next 3 chapters about priests and what they do with the offerings and their ordination or consecration, all of that. And then now we're kind of starting to shift into community life, what I'm calling community life. First chapter, each chapter deals with an area of what's clean and unclean. First chapter deals with animals, which are clean or unclean. Many of us have heard about that. Childbirth in chapter 12. Then in 13 and 14, I'm putting together, which involves skin diseases or molds or mildews. And then 14, which I've really been interested in because I really never knew that Scripture dealt with climate change. It deals with carbon emissions. And so yeah.
It's not those kinds of emissions.
It's what?
It's not those kinds of emissions.
It's not those kind of emissions? In that case, we'll be going through chapter 13 or 14. No. I told Doc I've waited 3 months to have that lame joke. Thank you. Dale almost ruined it. Or Michelle sent me something from Dale last night that talked about vehicle emissions, and so I thought he's going to ruin the whole thing. Okay, class is over. That was it. Okay, we had to get that in. So as we're going through these sections, if you're like me, you may be asking questions. I want you to think about some of these questions if you had. In general, why? I mean, these are some interesting sections of Scripture. What is clean and unclean? What makes something clean, unclean? Why are some things unclean, others clean, that seem to be pretty similar? What's God's purpose? And how might that apply to us today? And there's just a lot that I don't know that probably I think in general we won't know, because at least the scholars I read, there's a lot that they don't know. But we'll start out with a quick review, like I said. Before we start chapter 11, I just want to mention one thing. I guess I use the word interesting a lot. That's just the only word I can think of that comes to mind. It's interesting. You read about Leviticus and you think, Leviticus is where we go to learn about what's clean and unclean. But if you look, the idea of clean, or even the word clean, is used before. Matter of fact, it's used 3 times in Genesis. And 2 are in reference to Noah and the flood. And so in my mind, I'm learning what clean, and the Israelites are learning what clean and unclean are. And in Leviticus, but Noah is instructed to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 2 pairs of unclean. So they must have known at that point, or they must have had some idea or had some thought about something being clean, unclean. And then right after the flood, he builds an altar, and makes a burnt offering. We talked about that. Here's a burnt offering all the way back there of clean animals and birds. Makes a point of spelling that out. So it's already known that the understanding of it is assumed, or either the Israelites had their own understanding from whatever developed in culture. We don't know. Chapter 11. As I said, we're not going to do long readings. I've just got an introduction. Who did I give 11? Oh, yes, because you came in first. You got the longest one. If you would read that, and then we'll discuss. Okay.
Okay. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, These are the living things that you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, and chews the cud among the people you may eat. Everything in the waters that has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, you may eat. And these you shall detest among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are detestable. The eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, more are listed. All winged insects that go on all fours that are detestable to you, yet you may eat those that have jointed legs above their feet, with which to hop on the ground.
Thank you. And then it goes on to give a detailed list of each of these sections. And then in 43 to 45, the end of the chapter, there's a summary, and which we could spend a lot of time on all of this, where he says, essentially, do not make yourself unclean for these. Do not make yourself unclean by these, for I am the Lord your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. And we discussed that a few weeks ago. First time that that's said, it's the first time that God refers to himself as holy in those words, and then it comes up several more times in Leviticus. And then another little phrase that's repeated is, for I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, which is 8 times in Leviticus. So that seems to be significant. Again, we could spend a lot of time. But this chapter is considered by Jews to be one of the 2 main sources for dietary, if I could say it, dietary laws. And they seem to serve a really practical purpose, that is for the health of the community. Okay, so we're going to come back to that in a little bit, but it's interesting to me that Scripture doesn't say why these things are unclean or why they have a defiling effect, the things that do. And there are lots of theories. Almost every commentary has a different thought on it. Some are specific to health, but you can knock holes in that too. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You can go, well, pork. Everybody knows if you don't cook pork well, that can lead to bad things. If you don't cook certain scavenger fish well, that can lead to bad things. Well, those are pretty good. But if you go through the list, that doesn't necessarily work with every single thing that's listed, or at least from what I could find. And then, but generally you can see that. Some have a theory that it's related to creation, which I won't spend much time. The creation story. You have the creation of the animals walking on the earth. You have the sea, creatures of the sea, creatures of the sky, the birds, and these are all listed. And there's some reference somehow to that. I don't know. There's others that are related to, if you think about it, what are the things we sacrifice? Cattle, goats, sheep. All of them just eat grass, I think, or some kind of vegetation. I'm not a farmer. But the things that are, most of the ones that are unclean eat flesh or will eat blood. I'm not sure about a few. I don't know if camels do or not. But, and then most of the fish listed that are unclean or what we would think of a scavenger. So there may be something related to that, you know. So we're going to jump to chapter 12, and again we'll kind of do an overall discussion afterwards. So, which deals with childbirth, which seems kind of strange. Who's got chapter 12? Gary or Gerald?
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As at the time of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days in the blood of her purifying. She shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall continue in the blood of her purifying for 66 days."
Thank you. And that there's some more verses, but that's the shortest chapter. So I mean, it's pretty much what it deals with. First, the question, why the time of uncleanness after childbirth? Obviously, childbirth isn't a sin. We'll come to some of that in chapter 15. Anytime there's a blood discharge or issue, there's an uncleanness that we'll read about. So that would account for the 7 days, which is the number that's used in 15. We'll come to. But the question I have for you to think about is, why the 40 days if you have a son and 80 days if you have a daughter? It's not explained. Anybody got? Of course, I have a random thought here, but I want to hear. Lawrence.
I suspect that most of this has to do with health, or virtually all of it does, either physical health or spiritual health. And we today separate those to our detriment, in my view. If a person has a heart problem, he sees a cardiologist. If he's anxious, he sees a psychiatrist. I mean, we have all these specialties. God only had one, and it was him. And if you just look back over the period of my lifetime, our understanding of what is healthy has changed immensely, and how to deal with it has changed immensely. And it's been, 4,000 years since this was written?
I thought you were talking about your lifetime, and when you said 3,000 or 4,000 years, okay. No, thank you.
But still,
Yeah.
Look back 200. We went to the barbershop and you got bled, for Pete's sake.
So we may still find a reason why that's there. I want to throw out. I'm sorry. Were you done? Yeah. Did you have more? I'm sorry.
My only point is that our understanding of health practices change, and the fact that we don't understand what God commanded them to do or why shouldn't cause us pause.
Good. And that's part of my reason for pointing out some of the speculation, because whether the exact theory is true or not, we can see that there are different rationales out there. And there's things, as Lauren said, God knows what he's doing, and a lot of things have been discovered through the years, which will relate to some of the other chapters that have proven the wisdom. And but I do want to throw out one, and this may be heavily influenced through the lens of our culture. But Warren Wiersbe and a couple other guys have this thought that given the way women were devalued, or pretty much chattel, and given that men had pure dominance, and given that a son was so much more valuable than a daughter, okay, well, I mean, we can go through lots of scenarios, but so we can see modern day examples of what's happened in China when they limited births. What happened to a lot of the girls? Because the guys were more valuable. And so you could see, oh, it's a girl. I want to start to have a son as soon as possible, regardless of how the woman felt or whether she was in pain or recovered or anything else. I mean, that doesn't take a stretch of imagination to think that that could be a possibility. So it actually provides a layer of protection for the woman, both during menstruation, that 7-day period, but also for the birth. And then it's longer for a daughter. And there's kind of, some seemed a little bit a stretch to me, but so the woman could bond with a daughter just to add value to the daughter till there was a point where it wouldn't be easy to just dismiss her. I don't know about all of that, about true. I think the protection of the woman seems like it could be one of the reasons, because we know how God has done that throughout Scripture in ways that he doesn't overturn and create a revolution in culture, but he does what are radical things, but they're small things to protect those who aren't valued. And you could see that, I guess you could see it whether we're talking about women or we could talk about somebody who had a disability. You could see through the ages, how that's dealt out. Okay, so we're going to jump into 13:14.
Can I make one comment, Dave?
I don't know.
Are you scared?
JJ, take the mic away.
The thing we don't know, so much of this is to separate them from the cultures around them.
Mm-hmm.
So because we don't know what the cultures around them, what those behaviors were after the birth of a son or after the birth of a daughter, maybe this was a way to differentiate that scenario from what was going on, which we don't know what that was.
Yeah.
So that's why we have all these questions.
That's a good point. But I think generally true, women weren't treated very well. 13 through 14, I lumped these two together just for time, and plus they deal very similar. Who has
A woman.
Where did I write my reading in here? Oh, I wanted to tell one little thing first. Before we read this, you're going to see on the back of my handout here, you're not expected to know this, but if you did get a chance to see this, I call it an if-then chart, diagnostic kind of thing. Someone actually went through and mapped out chapter 13, all the choices. So we'll come back to diagnostic. But you can see there is a lot of diagnostics, or what we would call it, in chapter 13, 14. But one author mentioned something I just thought was really interesting. There is an Egyptian medical journal. Some of you probably heard about this. I see Gary shaking his head. The Papyrus Ebers, I think it's called, or Evers. It comes from the 1550. It's been dated BC. And it was the common medical practices and beliefs in Egypt. It's an Egyptian scroll. It's 60, 70 meters or feet long and total. And it has all these remedies. And so if you think about it, 1550, when was Moses around? Most people think 1500s, somewhere in there. And Moses came, he was raised in a Pharaoh's household. Israel had come out of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. So they would have known a lot of these practices, or maybe they even observed them. We don't know. I just wrote down two because I think for blindness, you use 2 eyes of a pig. You drain the water from the eyes, mix it with honey and a few other things, inject it into, not the eye, the ear, and you recite twice, I have brought this thing and put it in its place. The crocodile is weak and powerless. Now, I don't know how this ever makes it into a journal, because I'm wondering what person actually, anyway, maybe when somebody poked their ear, I don't know what and migraines, I mean, we all hate that Carrie's had migraines for so many years. The remedy is make an idol of a crocodile, stuff its mouth with herbs, and strap it to her head. Yeah. It's not a funny subject what Carrie's dealt with, but the cures are funny. So think about these versus what God instructs Moses to do. So would somebody read the reading from 13?
Okay.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron, priest, or to one of his sons, the priests, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body. Same process for burn, boils, raw flesh, or for mildew, mold on garments or walls of house.
Thank you. And sometime you may just want to browse through one or two of these scenarios on this if-then sheet, because it essentially tells them you isolate them for 7 days. If it's such and such, you isolate them for 7 days. If it's a little different, you don't have to. But if they go for 7 days, you go back to them. And if it's done this, then it's another 7 days. If it's done this, so you just see this diagnostic thing. Again, we're going to race through this because I've already used too much time. One, when it says leprous, everything I read, and plus I looked up the Hebrew, agrees it's not leprosy. It doesn't mean leprosy as we think of leprosy or Hansen's degree. It was an infectious skin disease. Now, whether they would have understood the idea of infectious, but it meant a skin disease that could spread to other people. The diagnostics, read one guy who said he had a new appreciation for priests because in addition to being butchers and handling barbecues and all that, they had to diagnose all this stuff. And then they had to go and follow up. So you can imagine. But let's see here. There's a section, these two chapters pretty much cover the same type of thing, but in the middle of it, in chapter 14, the first half, it deals with restoration. And it talks about the priest is the one that's supposed to go outside the camp to this person and check and see how they're at, how they are. So you have the priest going, which is, we can relate the imagery there to God coming to us, God coming to the community. The person wasn't being abandoned. The other part was that it was kind of showed that the idea was restoration, to bring the person back. One mention, I have this up here for a reason. If anybody's ever read about the red yarn and ask a question, maybe you haven't, laid awake at night. I was reading that one of the things that for cleansing is to take hyssop, cedar, and red yarn, and then you go through this whole process with blood and sprinkling it on the person and all this good stuff. And I'm going, red yarn? Where did that get in the picture? Okay, I can understand. Well, it turns out cedar and hyssop were both known to be kind of cleansing. Kind of there was in just culture in general. And the red yarn, they think, it just tied them together and it was red because it symbolized blood. So whether that's accurate, that's just blood. Okay, then we could spend a lot of time talking about isolation and how that hasn't been the practice or wasn't even until fairly recent when there was a disease. But we're not. Chapter 15, let's do the reading, please. Carolyn's got that one. She said she'd read it because she'd been a nurse, so she didn't mind.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any man has a discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. And this is the law of his uncleanness for a discharge, whether his body runs with his discharge or his body is blocked up by his discharge. It is his uncleanness. Every bed on which the one with the discharge lies shall be unclean, and everything on which he sits shall be unclean. And anyone who touches his bed, sits on anything he sat on, or touches his body, shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening.
Can you read the next section, please?
The same process if a man has an emission of semen, including sexual relations, or if a woman has a blood discharge either through monthly menstruation or an abnormal.
Oh, I read
normally
it.
Another. What?
Sorry.
Okay.
I had a typo there. I just realized, sorry. Or abnormally at another time. So thank you. That last part is not just my little summary, the last thing she read there. So I'm got excited about doing Leviticus because I'm drawn to the whole thing of God calls us near and the whole thing about holiness. So I threw it at the elders as an idea to do Leviticus. Somewhere in there, I started reading a whole lot more, and then a song came to mind, and I know that we don't have time for this, but you don't have to. Can you do this just quick? See if it works. If it doesn't work, we move on because it's not that important. That's for you, Carrie.
Radio is blasting. Someone's knocking at the door. I'm looking at my girl, and she passed out on the floor. I see so many things I ain't never seen before. Don't know what it is. I don't want to see no more.
Thank you. Second. I don't want to see no more. Anyway, I'm going, that's not what I signed up for. I feel like when I went in the Air Force with a recruiter, this isn't, anyway, he told me a whole lot of other things. Okay, so we have no time because I want to have discussion. Sorry, but that's worse than the other one, Michelle said. So the idea, depending on which translation, the word for discharge or flow or issue is used over 20 times in this chapter. So can you guess what this chapter is about? It just means a flow of liquid. It can, you name it, bodily fluid. The first section that they assigned to men, but I would assume it would be anybody, could be anything from diarrhea to urinary infections to STDs, you name it. The second is normal sexual relations. The third section is normal blood flow during a monthly period. The fourth is abnormal bleeding. We think of the woman that went to Jesus for an extended period of time. It makes a point of saying for an extended point. For becoming clean, it is not sure. I don't know exactly what this means, but it is interesting. The normal discharges are all of them that are listed are you're unclean for 7 days, then you bathe and you go on. For the abnormal ones, which we're seeing as a disease, unclean for 7 days, bathe, and then an offering to the priest for atonement. So, just that. And then at the end of this chapter, there's a summary statement that I think it relates to this and the whole 5 chapters. This is at the end of 15. Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst. So there's definitely something beyond just this is to be healthy. There is a ritual purpose to be clean when you go to the tabernacle or when you come to God. But I believe there's definitely a health purpose too. I mean, there's a dual purpose, a community, really community for the community health. So I've got a few questions. Good. Okay, we got 10, 12 minutes. I know we've rushed through those. We could go through any one. So any one of the sections that you have a burning question, I know Michelle wants me to get into the nitty gritty. I've gone as far as I'm going to go, I think. Excuse me. No, seriously, we can discuss it.
Seriously, so y'all know one of my colleagues is a Jewish rabbi, so I asked her about these things.
Oh, good.
So the Orthodox Jewish women do go to the mikveh, which is the place of the ceremonial baptism. We think of it like a baptistry. So the Orthodox women go every month, 7 days after the end of their monthly cycle, and do the purification bathing. But so I asked Anna, she's a Reformed Jew, I said, do y'all do that? And she said, we don't do it on a regular basis every month, but we do it occasionally. And she said, it's a very holy thing. I mean, it is like, when she was talking to me, it's like baptism for us. So it would be like us occasionally coming here and saying, I want to cleanse myself before God and immersing ourselves in the water of baptism. So I just thought that was
neat.
Very interesting.
Yeah, glad you showed. Because since God mixes these things with, I'll just say disease, abnormal things, which especially at the time they would have viewed, many people would have viewed as there's something sinful going on, or this person has done something wrong, or this person's angered the gods, whatever, and that's why they have all this. It's included normal functions. So really it is making a statement in as well that this is about obedience and purity to God, and I don't want to jump ahead. So I have a few questions. This one just real quick. One of those things that popped in my brain. This is from the outline. In many cases, how would anybody know you were unclean? They wouldn't, would they? Yeah. I mean, if you got a skin disease, okay. But if you sat where somebody else had sat that was unclean, nobody necessarily would know that. Or you could just go through it. If you were out on your own and you ate an animal that wasn't unclean, nobody would know. So so there's a certain level of individual responsibility called for here. As well as, there's a community responsibility, but we'll come back. So, due to time, I want to get on to some other things, so I'm going to fill in the blanks here, but you can discuss or not when we get a little farther. Another couple things I just thought were interesting. These chapters discuss prevention. In other words, don't eat, don't touch, unclean, and isolation until clean or better. But they never discuss how to cure the illness. When there's an illness, it never mentions do this so you can get better. Or what to do if a person doesn't get better, which we always know the stories of lepers outside of the camp. They have leprosy that's a lifetime. They've been there their whole life, not expected to come back, or whatever the case may be. And I'm going to ask the question now. You can answer it later when we move to the next thing. But any thoughts on why? And I think maybe because, I'll just say one, I think perhaps that's not the point, is being cured. But we'll see. And then we're going to wrap up. I'm going to throw out one thing, and then we'll wrap up with this last, just general question. I've got a few thoughts with it. One of the things that comes through in this to me that I think is really relevant to those of us who went through COVID, which is everybody, is the balance between protecting the individual and God's concern for the individual and the community's concern for the individual and protecting the community. Because I think you could make a pretty strong case that almost every one of these prescriptions have to do with protecting the community. Like I said, they don't, if you go away and isolate and you have a disease for 7 days, that doesn't make you better. It just lets you know and everybody else know whether you still have it. So that's about the community, not necessarily you. And all the things to do with various bodily fluids, well, they wouldn't have understood necessarily infections, but we all know nowadays, like Lauren said, that that's the number one way to catch something, is any sort of bodily fluid. So there's a sense of protecting the community. And that other side of that balance is we know isolation is not good. And there's been a lot of discussion about that with the kids in school, but we know as Christians and the church, we know that it's not good to be alone. So it's not good. It may be good for the community to be over here. It's not good to stay here. And that's why almost every one of these have a path to come back. But it doesn't address somebody who it stays ill. But I think we could probably infer from God's compassion and the way that he deals with people that are suffering and whatever terms you want to use, the compassion that he has and what he expects of the community in those situations. So I said that. So in general, in the next 5-7 minutes. What do you see the purpose for all these things? Or might be lessons for us today or messages for us today. Lawrence.
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the whole purpose is health. Spiritual health, physical health, all combined together. And this doesn't distinguish between the two, and perhaps we shouldn't either. But clearly, God wanted his people to survive as a people because he intended to come to those people, and he did.
Good thoughts. Gary?
I think your interest and Doc's interest in studying this is well focused because it is about the holiness code. And the key to Leviticus is, as you stated numerous times, I expect you to be holy because that's what I am. That's who I am. I am is all about. So I don't disagree with what Lawrence has shared. He's absolutely right. But I do think that our culture, particularly our rational reasoning side, always wants to make sense out of something. We want to say, why did God do this? Well, you can carry that way too far. Why does anybody get leprosy in the first place? Just so Jesus can heal them? In the New Testament, there's some indication that some people were sick just so Jesus could heal them. That's the whole purpose for their illness or their blindness or whatever it was. So I think we have to be, as our culture, it tends to be that way. We want everything explained. There is a mystery involved with being involved with the Creator. And the biggest mystery is we don't know why he wants to be involved with us. And the second biggest mystery is he's unfathomable. So we get in this cycle of, well, why does it say that? When the biggest point is he says, I'm holy. And I want to stress that otherness again, because that's exactly what he's doing with these people. They are going to be so different from everyone around them that everyone around them will know they're different. The problem is later, they won't know why they're different.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
If I might.
But I'm going to ask why.
I might as well make one other point.
Okay, quickly.
We as humans assign cause to random events. And your example of the Egyptian with the crocodile is one of those. Probably happened once, the guy got well, and they all concluded that's why. Wasn't why, had nothing to do with it. So often we make the error of assuming because two events appear to be correlated that their causality is involved, and when it's not.
Absolutely. Well, you see that a lot today. Okay, they're good comments, but since we're close to the end here, I was talking with Doc and Danny about this Friday. And just talking about still some of what seems randomness. And I think both of you are exactly right. We don't need to know why, but I think it's fascinating to me to discover little things along the way that you go, oh, wow, that's really cool, because now I can see the purpose for that one. And that leads me to have greater faith in the other areas that maybe I don't understand, if that makes sense. But Danny told a story about talking to Larry Kaplan, and I hope I don't mess this up real quick. Larry was a Jew, Heidi Kaplan's husband, who passed away, I'm not sure how many years ago. But he was a Jew. He was I don't know if he was non-practicing or his parents were Orthodox, very serious. They had a set of plates that they had that were reserved for the Seder. That's the only thing those plates were for. Well, the discussion was as we went around, everybody, probably his parents included, knew these plates in and of themselves weren't special in the sense that they were plates. But those plates were not only dedicated in the sense we think set apart, but every time they got those plates, it was a reminder of who God is and all the rest of it, his love, everything else. And I thought, boy, does that fits these chapters. And Michelle's story just captures it, I think. The idea that when you would go to these things, you might not know why this animal is clean or why this one isn't. But when you went there, your mind immediately thought, this is something that God has asked us to do. And so, and I think there's a real heavy, so I appreciate that. The emphasis or part of the lesson is to remember and putting things in our lives like that. Last, I think, in bringing this to the New Testament, isn't it interesting how all of this section of Leviticus, we are supposed to protect ourselves from the unclean and stay away from the unclean? Who does Jesus go to? I mean, there is a very clear connection between many of his miracles and Leviticus. I mean, with a leper, it's very, specific. I believe you can make me clean. And Jesus' answer is, be clean. And the woman with the issue. Yes, the woman with the issue of the blood. Jesus goes to, his holiness is completely, instead of becoming infected, which is kind of one way you think of uncleanness, instead of a clean person becoming infected by the unclean, Jesus' holiness, infect's probably a bad word, purifies the unclean. I just think that's cool in light of all this. So back to one of the original verses I mentioned several times in Hebrews 10. With these chapters in mind, through him let us draw near with true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Neat how that just all. Anyway, 7 till. Thank you.